Last week, I built the first PC I've gotten to use since I was in 7th grade, and the first PC I've had any kind of ownership over since ever. Aaron and I picked up the parts since it is quarantine and we do like to edit. We decided to build this massive editing rig. You can find the parts list below. This is going to just be a video about putting it together. We were told it would be a very simple affair, but despite having watched a few videos first, we did run into a few snafus. We also had technical difficulties with the mic. We didn't realize that it wasn't working until after we had already finished building it, so all of the audio from the build is gone now. Whoops. Alright, so this is us opening the case. The case was the very last part to get here. The rest of the parts had just been sitting around for about a week, waiting on this case to arrive. Taking the case out was not difficult at all, but we did have an issue where we thought we were supposed to open the front panel where the pre-installed fans are, and that is completely unnecessary. All we needed to do was open the front and back wall. Mistake number 2, we put the motherboard in first. We do this because we want the ports to match up with that front panel, and we were worried that if we put everything else on first, it would potentially get rattled around, but you can absolutely put in a bunch of other stuff onto the motherboard before you ever install it into the case. Whoops. As you can see, we put the graphics card in next, immediately after the motherboard. Huge mistake. It continues to get in the way of everything else throughout the rest of this build. Unfortunate. After putting the graphics card in, I realized we haven't even put in the processor or the heatsink that has to go on top of it, so we go ahead and do that, which is easily the most stressful part of the build for me. Going into this, I thought that putting in a very expensive processor would be the most stressful thing, just because I don't want to bend or break any of those tiny pins, but it slotted in very easily. However, the heatsink gave me a lot of problems. The thermal paste was pre-applied, and I could not get the fan to hook onto those tiny hooks. So I ended up pulling it off and putting it back on, and I'm just hoping that that thermal paste wasn't ruined in the process.
There it is. Okay, fan is installed.
Immediately after putting in the 2 bulkiest pieces of this build, we had to put in those tiny M2 SSDs, one of which went right in between the graphics card and the now installed heatsink that is not going anywhere. Despite installing an M2 SSD being one of the easiest things that you can do, I managed to fail this immediately by not first putting on the mounting screw. So after putting the M2 in, I had to pull it back out, put a mounting screw on, put the M2 in, and then of course lose that very tiny screw that goes into the mounting screw underneath the heatsink and the graphics card, and then dig around for that for a while. It wasn't until much later I would realize that using a magnetic screwdriver was absolutely an option. When it came time to install the hard drive and the solid-state drive, there was a moment of panic. Looking at the case, I thought that I would have to take the motherboard completely out in order to screw the solid-state drive to that back wall there. Luckily, the people who made the case are much smarter than I am. They have these tiny rubber things that go into the case, and then you just attach the feet to the SSD and mount it that way. The hard drive was even easier to install, although I did nearly break the plastic tray in half before I figured out that you can simply expand it to fit the hard drive. With everything installed, I thought I was surely almost done, and that's when I pulled out my power supply unit and realized just how complicated wiring can be. Wiring is probably not a fun process even if you know what you're doing, but if you don't know what you're doing and you're just hoping that you're plugging these cables into the correct places, then it's not only stressful, it's also just very confusing. Eventually, I did get everything into the correct slot. There were a few confusing parts, in particular plugging the power cables into the CPU correctly and plugging that 6 and 2-prong power cable into the GPU correctly, but after everything was wired, it was time to put the power supply unit into place and hopefully turn it on for the very first time. After a very confident me put the back panel and front panels back into place, we turned the computer on and nothing. So time to put it back on the desk and take everything apart? Except no, it wasn't. We actually just missed one of the switches.
This one first.
After flipping the correct number of switches,
Things are lighting up. Oh! Oh!
everything lit up and turned on, no problem. The entire affair took roughly 4 hours. I'm sure I could have saved myself some time by watching other people put together the builds first and not just having to go off of 6 different instruction manuals, so my bad. All in all though, nothing broke. I feel like I learned a lot from the experience and I'm glad I did it. This is just gonna be a really beautiful PC to look at from my couch while I'm playing PS4, and I can't wait. In all seriousness, despite having just the worst quality video and audio to edit with, editing on this PC is a dream, and I'm really glad I put the PC together myself. Thanks for watching.